And I'm reading today from Rays of the One Light. These are weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, written by Swami Kriyananda and based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. This week's reading is entitled, By Thinking Can We Arrive at Understanding? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. There are many places in the Gospels where we see Jesus in open conflict with the Pharisees. That is to say, with man-made as opposed to true mystical tradition. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 15, we see a good example of how they and he often locked horns. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem came and asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples break our ancient tradition and eat their food without washing their hands properly first?" Jesus, after scolding them for their hypocrisy in observing lesser rules so carefully while ignoring the much more important ones, said, "Listen and understand this thoroughly. It is not what goes into a man's mouth that makes him common or unclean. It is what comes out of a man's mouth that makes him unclean." It wasn't that Jesus counseled against such wholesome practices as washing one's hands before eating. In an age, however, when lesser rules were given too much importance relative to the truly important observances, cleansing the heart of impure desires, for example, he emphasized the supreme importance of loving God and of communing with him. The Pharisees, the orthodox religionists of his day, in other words, had brought true religion down to a level of intellectual hair-splitting. They mistakenly considered the way to understanding to lie through a minefield of definitions, which they tried to refine to ultimate exactitude. Jesus taught, however, that the intellect alone can never lead one to truth. Without love and deed, there is no ultimate verity. Without fixity of purpose, born of the heart's devotion, the intellect wanders endlessly. It cannot settle for long on anything. As the Bhagavad Gita says, the intellects of those who lack fixity of spiritual purpose are inconstant, their interests endlessly ramified. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. I ran across a quotation from Vincent van Gogh recently, which I was very struck by. He said, "I believe there is nothing more truly artistic than loving people." Isn't that marvelous from an artist of that caliber to say that? But we have to open our hearts. We have to develop intuition. There's that wonderful story of Edgar Cayce, a little frightening, this story, but he was standing in a busy, crowded building, about to get onto an elevator, and as he stepped forward, a force pushed him back. Everybody else got on, and the elevator broke and everyone was killed. It was through his intuition, the power of that intuition, that kept him safe. We've been doing our Raja Yoga course, and every year we review this marvelous body of yoga teachings. And every year I get so much more out of it. It's a wonderful, wonderful course. And we've been studying the yamas and the niyamas, the things to avoid and the things to put energy into on the spiritual path. They're like the 10 commandments of yoga. Non-lying, non-stealing, non-violence, non-sensuality, non-greed are the yamas. And I've been thinking about how the more we are aware of them, the more that we practice them, the more that we notice their presence in our lives, the more our heart's feelings and emotions are purified. It's like magic. And then the more we put into the niyamas, the more energy we put into cleanliness, contentment, self-study, sacrifice, and devotion, like this affirmation this morning, the more that we see opportunities to do these things, to put energy into them. Sacrifice is always the one that gets the worst rap. You know, nobody, it's like, sacrifice? Was that human sacrifice? And sometimes I've said that to God. Okay, I'm just your little human sacrifice. I have to do this. And he's always helped, by the way. He's always been there. But sacrifice, I'm coming to understand, is all about love. We want to rein in our energies so that we can focus them in an upward aspiration. That's what sacrifice is. It's not to punish. It's not to wear hair cloth and flagellate ourselves with a whip. You know, it's not that kind of thing. It's controlling our impulses to lash out with words or to go to the refrigerator instead of to the meditation seat. It's all those things to rein in our energy so that we can offer it. Speaking of those 10 commandments, I was reminded of one of the great moments of my life, which was when I was working as Swami Kriyananda's assistant, and I was in the living room, he was in the office, and I was doing something, I forget what, and he came in, "Nirmala, what am I missing?" Great moment, you know. The great writer is asking me something, and I thought, oh no. And he said, "I'm writing the 8 aspects of God: peace, calmness, wisdom, power, sound, light, love. And Nirmala, what's the last one?" And I was so happy I could smile at him and say, "Joy, Ananda." He had forgotten Ananda. Great moments. But anyway, what we have in these teachings is a roadmap to happiness, to joy, in fact. And all we have to do, as Asha has said, and I've always remembered, these teachings really work. You just have to do them. You have to actually practice them. And that's what we need to do, to offer ourselves more and more up to God. Can we reach understanding by thinking? Can we arrive at understanding? Well, thinking is important. We do have to study. We do have to memorize the little 8 aspects of God. That takes mental thinking about it. But unless we feel it in our hearts, it won't stick. We have to purify those feelings so that we can develop the intuition, which Yogananda said is the power to know God. We need it, not just to keep safe and not step into a broken elevator, but to not make all the mistakes that create karma for ourselves. I've been thinking about another beautiful quote from St. Paul in Philippians. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. And that's what we need, especially reading the news these days. Don't live in fear. I've often thought, terrorism and terrorists, they just want to invoke terror. We can't allow that. We can't live in fear. We have to live in faith. We're going to die at some point anyway. A friend of mine, he's a friend to all of us, Sam Padani, and he is a disciple of Yogananda through Dr. George. And I won't go into the story of him. It's quite fascinating. But there's some beautiful YouTube videos of Dr. George stories, and Sam Padani and some of the other devotees talk about him. Marvelous, marvelous saint. But I'll tell you this joke, speaking of death, a little bit. I don't know if it's quite Sunday service worthy, but here we go anyway. It came from Sam, and I just love this guy. So there's an old cowboy, and he's talking to a little girl in front of the general store, and he says to her, the secret of longevity is you take a little bit of gunpowder and you sprinkle it on your oatmeal in the morning. And you do that every day and you'll live a long, long life. And the little girl thought, okay. This was an old cowboy. So she lived to be 103. And she left behind 6 children and 12 grandchildren and 24 great-grandchildren and a 40-foot hole in the crematorium. And that is, I love that joke. I love Sam for sending around that joke. And Sam himself is in a life-threatening situation. He has this problem with his legs. He can hardly get around anymore. And he has this amazing attitude about it of, I am in the hands of God. And whatever he wants to do with this body, he can do. And he, Sam, is just in bliss most of the time. And he's been connecting with his group of friends, which I am honored to be on this email list. And he sends little, what do you call that kind of humor, like hangman's gallows humor. He sends those little things, and he sends lots of music So all of his music that he is a musician and he loves music, so he sends out music to all his friends. That's his way of saying goodbye if he has to leave this world. And I do want to say a prayer for him. Let's send him some ohms after this talk, just because the power of prayer is so important. And if we feel, I know I have often felt this way, do I have any devotion? How can I increase my devotion? How can I draw closer to God? Well, we can pray and ask Him to open our hearts. Ask Him to come into our lives, to guide us, to be there. It's not rocket science, God, please help me. It doesn't take much. There's a beautiful book that Sandy just lent me that I have been enjoying so much. It's called Physicians' Untold Stories. And in one of the stories, I started reading the book. I told Dharmadas about it. He told his mother about it. And his mother is a nurse and a social worker. So she downloaded the book right away. She wanted to read it. And she got to the second story, and she said, wait, that doctor is my cousin's husband. So anyway, there's this one story about a doctor who really wanted to help people in underprivileged countries. And so he studied surgery, but not just specializing in one surgery. He took courses in all kinds of surgeries to try to really broaden his knowledge. And he went to Ethiopia, and he was supposed to have this other surgeon who had been there for many years train him for 5 years. That was the deal. And the surgeon got reassigned after a few months. So he was on his own, seeing over 100 patients every day, performing 8 or more surgeries every day. Starting at 5 a.m., going until the night, every day. And he did this for 7 months until he felt like he was going to die because he just couldn't keep up that pace. And so usually in prayer every morning he would say, God, give me the strength to do whatever I need to do today to help be with me, helping these people. But this one morning he just said, God, if you don't send me help today, this will be my last day. And so he went to the clinic, he did everything. He was in the middle of a thoracic surgery, and there was a knock on the door, and it was his wife. This was very, very rudimentary operating room with one light bulb, and if the electricity went out, they just picked up the table with the patient and brought it over to the window. It was that kind of conditions. And his wife never visited him because she couldn't stand the sight of blood. But she boldly knocked on the door, and she opened the door and she said, Harold, this is Dr. somebody. He's here to relieve you. And our friend, the doctor, said he got weak in the knees, realizing that God had answered his prayer. And this doctor, who was from New York or Chicago, I can't remember where, but he had woken up after 2 years in his own practice and decided, I need to give back to the world. And so through a series of almost funny coincidences. He said things like, I thought, well, where should I go in the world? So I took a map and I decided to use the scientific method. I closed my eyes and I turned the map 3 times and I put my finger down. And it was Ethiopia. And many things like that brought him to this doctor's door. But we have to realize that miracles happen right now, today, when we need them. There is no time and space. It's not as though God is some ancient concept that primitive peoples used to have. God is right now in you and in me. And that's where we have to realize him. So I'll just end with a little acronym that I came up with yesterday for developing intuition. And it's FEEL, feel. And we have to purify the feelings. That's what helps develop intuition. Develop intuition means to purify and heighten our feelings so that they're not caught in the cross currents of negativity. So F stands for focus. Focus and concentrate on what you are doing, who you are speaking with, and create a heightened sense of awareness around you. When we lived in India, we would get notices by email from the American Embassy, and one of the phrases that they would often say is, maintain situational awareness. And I always love that. We still say that to ourselves, but keep that heightened sense of awareness. Don't get so distracted by all the confusion of this Maya, this delusion. E stands for empathize. Have compassion for other people. Anything can happen. We can lose everything in a moment or gain everything in a moment. Everyone goes through so much stuff, so much. Have compassion for everyone. You could be in that place at any moment. So empathize. The other E stands for experiment. Let God in. I remember a simple example. We can do this in everyday life over and over. Many, many opportunities to do this. It was late at night. I was really tired. I wanted to go to bed. The kitchen was a mess. And I really tried to, just for sanitary reasons, to put the kitchen to bed at night so it's not just dishes in the sink. And I looked at it. I was exhausted. And I said, but God isn't exhausted. God, you got to help me. And so I said, okay, let me just start. And that's very important. Let's just start and draw that energy in. A little minor miracle. It was over. I was cleaned up. It was done. God helps. God helps with everything. Everything. If we ask. And of course, the L stands for love. We have to develop love. Love for every situation, love for every ailment that's trying to teach us something in our bodies, love for every little person we pass on the street, every siren that goes by. It's an opportunity to send love. Make your life a prayer of love to God. That's the way to be free, and it's the way to be happy.
This reading contains the ingredients of, but does not specify a certain karmic law that Swamiji would occasionally remind us of that comes from India, which is when a duty conflicts with a higher duty, it ceases to be a duty. And that, oh God, here we go again. Well, let's just see if it behaves. If I don't wiggle around too much, maybe it'll be. And that little aphorism is a challenging one because often the higher duty requires a higher level of energy, a higher level of understanding or appreciation or empathy, as Nirmala was pointing out in her FEEL acronym. We don't compare notes because, one of us will take the other one's points during Sunday service. So I didn't hear this until just now, like you all did, but I love it. Anyway, I had a couple of experiences in India, speaking of our time in India. And the first one that relate to this duty conflicting with a higher duty and just learning and understanding. So the situation was we were starting our first house in India, and this was a big ashram house. 8 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, huge basement, which was our temple and our warehouse and our publications department. I mean, it was a big deal getting started with all. So we just moved into an empty house, practically started sitting on 5-gallon pails. I mean, it was that basic. And one of the things that you do, that we did in every house that we ever lived in, which was quite a few in India, is we set up a water filter, water purification at the sink or in the kitchen to have clean drinking water that's predictable. And so this was being installed by somebody, and I walked in on the installation and I went, whoa, 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 whoa. He's installing it on, in plain view. It's like this defies the laws of plumbing the way I understand them in America. You stick the thing under the sink. You don't worship it. You don't bring flowers to it. I mean, it's not the centerpiece of your kitchen, this thing with wires and pipes and tubes and, stuff hanging everywhere. It was like, and there was no way on heaven, unless I was going to install the dumb thing myself, there was no way that was going under the counter. It was not going to happen. First of all, you have to drill a hole in a granite countertop, which, they are perfectly capable of doing in India, but I mean, no, we don't do that. And I will never forget Vidura, who was an old hand at India by this time. He'd been there many times, taken lots of pilgrimage groups all over the countryside. He knew a little bit about India. And he just said to me, I won't try to quote exactly, but he said basically, you need to pick which hill you're willing to die on. You need to decide which battle you're willing to fight here, because you only get so many, and do you really want to spend it all on the stupid water filter? I said, all right, put the stupid thing wherever you want to put it. Well, there was a logic to it, which is that water filters sometimes leak. And if they leak under the sink, you don't notice it for however long, until it's a big disaster, and it's going through the ceiling down below and it's messed up everything. Well, sure, if it leaks on top of the counter, it all drains into the sink. Who cares? Life goes on. Okay, there was a logic to it. I learned the logic to it. I also took that lesson to heart. Figure out which battles you're going to fight, because you don't get to fight every single one, but the ones that you're supposed to fight those. Okay, lesson learned. The second story I wanted to share is a story that I will describe as Dharmadas versus the water heater. And a water heater in India is called a geyser. And Now you have to realize it's not spelled Geezer, and it's not like an old codger, with a gristly beard and all that. There's a different spelling, which I'll get to in a moment when I share what happened, which is Nirmala and I were not getting a lot of sleep in those days because the days were long and Swami was often up in the night and he had a little doorbell that would ring in our room if he needed us, and et cetera, et cetera. But on this one particular night, we were gone. We were out. It was 2 or 2:30 in the morning, and I hear a sound that you don't want to hear. It's the sound of steam coming out of your water heater in the bathroom and spraying like a geyser all over the place, which, by the way, is how you spell geyser. Geyser. So I went into the bathroom with this awkward situation because it's an electric water heater. There's boiling water spraying everywhere and it's all over the floor. And I've got to get to this thing and unplug it to make it stop spraying all over the place. And which I did, and as you can sort of gather, I'm here to tell the story. So I did live, I did not electrocute myself. And I came to learn. And by the way, this happened a second time. It didn't happen just once. The second time, however, I caught it before it came out. I heard it starting to hiss, and that was enough to wake me up. And I got in there and I pulled that plug out of the wall, and that was the end of that. And at that point, what I learned is that there's a whole system to this. And the system is that you turn on your water heater. There's a switch to the outlet. We don't do this in America so much, but there's a switch on the outlet. 20 minutes before you're going to take your shower, you turn the switch on and the water heater heats up and you get your 5 or 10 gallons of hot water and there's enough to take your shower. Now you're not going to luxuriate in there for 45 minutes or an hour, but I mean there's enough to do a basic shower. After your shower's done, you wait another 20 minutes or so, you turn it off. 40 minutes of on time for your water heater and you're done. And it stays hot for another, however, 8, 10, 12 hours, whatever. Okay, that's the system, is the water heater basically stays off all the time. Partly to save energy, although I seriously debate how much really do you save, because how much is it really on during the day? However, that question aside, there was a system to it. You could also buy a new water heater for $20 more and it wouldn't explode on you, which I decided was worth the $20 more. And that I would leave it on all the time because I didn't necessarily have the luxury of waiting 20 minutes when it was time to take the shower. I had to get it while it was time. It wasn't, our schedules were not predictable. To me, that was the higher duty, which was worth the higher level of energy output. And this is sort of a silly example, a silly story on one level, but it was also a case of needing to learn, okay, this is how it's typically done, and this is why it's typically done. And for many people, that extra $20 represents a heck of a lot of money, and so it's worth going through that little effort every day because that's important. Okay, for me, it was a different priority. And for all of us in our lives, I'll just digress momentarily to the situation in Ukraine. There's a war going on. We haven't seen this kind of war in a long time. Yes, I slightly misspoke in the purification. There has been war in Europe, in the Balkans in the 90s, but it wasn't with superpowers and the potential of nuclear war. I mean, it wasn't quite on that level. It was pretty serious for them, but it didn't sort of affect everybody. But there are people in Ukraine, and there are people in lots of places who are going to make life and death decisions. They're going to decide, literally, I'm willing to die on this hill today or yesterday or tomorrow. Most of us are not called upon to decide, okay, I'm willing to die for this. But there's another issue that we are called upon to decide. And in some ways, this is the more challenging one. And this is an example that Swamiji gave to us through his own life. What are we willing to live for? It's one thing to be willing to die for something, because that could be over in 5 seconds. I mean, you make the right choice, you do something heroic, and you're in the next world, and you've died a heroic death, and there's a heavenly reward for that, and it's fine, sure, whatever. But what if you have to live for something for 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? What will we choose to live for? And I will ask you, and segueing on to what Nirmala was saying, live for the love of God. Live for the chance to send that harmony and peace and light into the world. The world very definitely needs it now. And we may think that, well, what's my little voice? What's my little heart? What's my little prayer going to do to the whole thing? Oh, well, it's going to do a whole lot relative to you. Each one of us can be a lighthouse. One lighthouse in the ocean stops a whole long line of ships from crashing into the rocks. Just one. And if we get the chance to be that lighthouse, then our lives are full of light. So let's be that lighthouse in the world and act as instruments for that blessing to come into the world. Namaste.